So welcome to our March edition of Zoom Seekers on, I guess it's International Pi Day, 3.14, 314. And that does not mean everybody gets pi at the end of, well, if you want to have pi, that's totally up to you. But we got an interesting talk going on tonight. You guys probably know Dan Orr. Dan has spoken to us a number of times before, usually talking about safety stuff. Dan's a former president of Dan. Just to be clear, the organization Dan was not named after Dan. It was very confusing when Dan was head of Dan, but you know that he retired from Dan, and that solved that problem. And Aviad Cahana is on. I'm not sure where he appears on your screen, but he's got the is it Avelo or Avelo, Aviad? Avelo. So he's got that above him, and he's invented, without tipping my hand totally on it, he's invented a new way of buoyancy control. And so Dan and Aviad are really here to sort of tell you about that. And you may pick up some dive safety tips tonight, but also you'll learn a little bit about this newfangled contraption that Aviad has developed. So without further ado, let us all start off with the big Reef Seekers. Thank you for them coming. Aviad, by the way, is in Hawaii. Dan is in Montana. I'm sitting in Southern California. You couldn't ask for 3 different weather climates tonight. So yeah, we got everything covered. But let's let them roll ahead, and you can tell us all about this. So guys, you got it.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me share a screen. Okay. Let me know that you can see it and hear it, okay?
Yep, we got it.
Okay, cool. So first of all, thank you for being here. This whole thing came from scuba equipment being very heavy. And we don't know who made this original meme, but we loved it, so we shared it with us. And really, the whole thing started by, I was in the scuba industry for many years as an instructor, and then I got out of it. And when I got back, it just felt like things were still heavy and cumbersome. And so the impetus for this idea came from scuba is still heavy and cumbersome. And Dan and I will talk today about why is it so heavy? Was it always that heavy? Is it just weight, or do we have other issues? And what can we do to make it better? So the first question that comes to mind is why is it so heavy? And the answer comes from buoyancy. If you take an average wetsuit and a BC, even if it's empty, and an empty tank, the standard aluminum tank, 80 cubic feet, or the 12 liter, as it's called, and you put them in water, you will get a total buoyancy force of 70 pounds. In other words, it will displace 70 pounds of water. In order to sink that, you would have to carry 70 pounds of weight. And it doesn't matter if that weight comes from the tank itself, or the weight, or the BC, whatever combination of materials you use, you still need 70 pounds. And then on top of this, there is the 6 pounds of air that is compressed inside the tank. So what happens is that we all end up carrying, again, on average, something like 70 to 75 pounds. And scuba has been like that, and it was acceptable. This is just what it is. When you look at how much weight is too much, there's something called the rating of perceived exertion, and it's done by a percentage of your body weight. So if you take your own body weight and you take 15 or 20% of that, that's the total weight that you will feel comfortable carrying. And it's been around forever. It's been around in many different industries, especially the backpacking industry. But as soon as you go above 25% of your body weight and you need to carry that, you're getting into the realm of heavier and heavier and heavier. And at 70 pounds of gear, for most of us, we're here. And as an industry, we were okay with it. While every other industry is literally racing towards lighter and more efficient gear, we are sort of okay with carrying a lot. If you think about the revolutions that happen in mountain biking and climbing and skiing, we're very different. So the second question was, did it start like that? Did scuba start like that? So scuba started with a tank and a regulator and without a BCD. And the compressed air in the standard tank was 6 pounds, which means that they had to start the dive negatively buoyant by about 6 pounds. And then towards the end of the dive, after they consumed 5 pounds of air, they will reach neutral buoyancy. And so to begin the dive, they were just negatively buoyant. Now, starting the dive like that was for the few that were very good swimmers and strong water people. Starting the dive 6 pounds heavy in terms of forces, 6 pounds of force negative, is not comfortable or safe. And the reason for that is that we all have something that's called the tidal volume. So when you're sitting there right now, you're just sitting and breathing and listening to us, the tidal volume on average is about 500 milliliters, which is about 1 pound of change. And if you were in the water and you just breathe in and out comfortably, your buoyancy will change by about 1 pound. And that's where it's comfortable to control your buoyancy. When you are 6 pounds heavy, it's not easy to control your buoyancy with just the tidal volume. You need to make significant changes to breathing. So the reason, that's why it wasn't safe and it wasn't comfortable. But as more and more gas was consumed towards the end of the dive, when those two forces start to balance out more or less, you're getting into an area that ascending and descending doesn't change any buoyancy. There's no BC. Wetsuit, we'll touch on wetsuit in a second here, but those divers could swim up and down the water column with no changes to buoyancy, and this was the magical moment of scuba. The problem with it was that it only lasted for the last few minutes of the dive, and so to fix that, the BCD was introduced. Any inflatable vest or wing or backplate and wing. When we say BC, we mean any inflatable, any balloon that sits on our shoulders falls into that category. And it added buoyancy. Obviously, it fixed the beginning of the dive. But as BCs grew, and especially today, the BCs required more weight just to sink the BCD itself. So while it solved the problem, it also brought with it a large compressible volume that was introduced into scuba and was with us for the last at least 50 years. So a bit about compressible volume. When we dive today, most BCs require you, and most divers actually do that even when they're weighted perfectly. They still need to maintain a bubble that can keep them afloat and contrasting a force of something like 10 pounds of weight that pulls them down. That's a fairly large bubble. If you want a sense of that, it's about the size of a gallon of milk that you have to maintain through most of the dive. And every bubble like that is very sensitive to depth changes. Because of ambient pressure changes, you go up a little bit, it starts to pull you up. You go down a little bit, it starts to compress and gravity takes over. So the entire dive, we have this airbag that's riding with us up and down that wasn't there. With a much smaller compressible volume and a smaller bubble doesn't do it. The smaller bubble doesn't compress or expand as much as a larger one. It has to do with the physics of it, and it's related to the radius of the bubble to the power of 3. That's why a larger bubble has a much bigger pull than a smaller bubble as a result of depth changes. The result is, as I mentioned before, we have our tidal volume that is a relatively small volume that is very easy to control, and then we carry a pretty large bubble on us. And so every time we go up a little bit, it starts to pull us up or down. And it's more than we think today. We just got used to it. So the ratio between the 1 pound that we can control and the 10 pounds size bubble is very large today. And that, what it does is it creates a very unique zone or a narrow zone in which buoyancy can be controlled with the lungs. And it's a depth range that we defined as the zone of stable neutral buoyancy. And it means how many feet can you ascend or descend without need to touch your BC, and while you're not changing your breathing too much. You really are breathing normally and comfortably. And with today's gear, because the compressible volume is so large, that zone is very narrow. I mean, we're within a small zone, and if you think about your diving, you see that you can only go up a feet or two, maybe 3, and you need to change something. And it's not that neutral buoyancy doesn't exist today. Neutral buoyancy, there is perfect neutral buoyancy today. It's just not stable. There's a sense of instability. Every time you change something, you need to make a change. If you reduce the compressible volume, the more you reduce it, the wider this zone becomes. A wider area that if you just swim up and stop, you will just stop and you will just hover there. You don't need to change anything. If you have an issue or a student has an issue, while they're dealing with the issue, they stay where they stopped. They don't have to deal with the issue and deal with buoyancy control. So the compressible volume is very important for scuba and always have been. It's one of the skills that are hard to teach. So that explains why at the end of the dive, these divers had a fantastic experience. They didn't have a large compressible volume. And so they had an ultra-stable neutral buoyancy across a really large depth range. So the first question that comes to mind is, what about wetsuits? Wetsuits are considered a compressible volume. Wetsuits are made out of neoprene, which is essentially a sponge of closed bubbles. And neoprene on the surface is just a bunch of bubbles. And then as you descend and the pressure compresses them, there's the perception that they compress a lot. They don't. They can't really. All these tiny bubbles are very hard to compress because if you're starting from a very small bubble to begin with, and you also have to overcome the mechanical force of the rubber or the neoprene rubber in between the bubbles. And on top of that, they do flood a little bit. So what we did at Avelo in the early days is we tested hundreds of wetsuits of all combination and thicknesses and double wetsuits and triple wetsuits. And the conclusion is that as a scuba, as the industry, we exaggerated for many years. There's a perception that the wetsuit compress a lot. They don't. And that was backed by evidence. Wetsuits, even very thick ones, and very thick ones, I mean, 2 different wetsuits of 7 millimeters can be worn by a diver. They exhibit very minor compressible volume. The change in buoyancy is limited to 2 to 3 pounds between surface and 100 feet. The BCD is not really there to compensate for wetsuit compression. It does help with that, but it's not really there for that. It really is to balance the additional weight throughout most of the dive, and especially the first 30, 40 minutes of the dive. So to sum it all up, today's scuba philosophy evolved to add more stuff. We have a tank. In the tank, there's compressed gas, 6 pounds of that. We know we're going to lose that through the dive, so we add weight. So it will counteract the loss of compressed gas. Well, then we have to start the dive negatively buoyant. So we added a fancy balloon. And what we ended up with is really a large compressible volume and a weight that we need to balance with a delicate device that is called our lungs, that really is limited to 1 pound of force. That's why the standard scuba system is inherently heavy. And it also provides an unstable form of neutral buoyancy. And so on a long walk to a dive site here in Hawaii, and then later on after water, the idea came to say, what if instead of adding buoyancy and more buoyancy, what if we could remove buoyancy from the tank itself? If we know that the core problem is you're going to have 6 pounds of gas in the tank and you're going to lose it throughout the dive, right? Instead of adding weight to do that, what if the tank itself can become smaller? So as we lose a pound of mass here, the tank just will lose a bit of buoyancy on and on throughout the dive. If we could get to that, you can now start looking at much lighter systems that are really just part of the physics of how scuba evolved until today. To do that, you get a tank that has an internal bladder. You have a rigid shell on the outside, and you have a bladder internally that can accommodate all of the air that this tank would have. And as you introduce water, you compress the bladder. In other words, you essentially lose volume from the tank itself. And then instead of adding more and more weight, you can just use water, and you can start with a much lighter system, significantly lighter than standard scuba. Because it's so light and it displaces the same volume like a standard scuba tank, just imagine jumping into water with just a tank and no weight. You're buoyant right there. So if you take an even lighter tank, you'll be even more buoyant. So it provides flotation when you need it, at the beginning, at the end of the dive. Instead of carrying weight, not only you start with a lightweight tank, you just use ambient water as your weight, as your ballast weight, just like submarines do. And it doesn't change your buoyancy. That's one of the biggest advantages of this approach, is there is no air pocket. The gas that's compressed in here is so highly compressed that that's essentially rigid. It's not affected by ambient pressure. You control how much water goes in and out. And that's how we came up with the two main components of the Avelo system. We have a hydro tank. A hydro tank is exactly what I just described. It's a lightweight shell made out of carbon fiber. There's an aluminum liner inside, just like today's tanks. The bladder inside is different than today's bladders. It's much thicker than bladder in BC, but it was made for it. And we have in between, the area in between the shell of the tank and the bladder is called the water chamber. When you fill this tank with air, it pushes all of the water out. The air pressure inside the bladder just expands it like a balloon, and it will push all of the water out from here, and the water will be out of the tank. So the tank starts with no water in it. By now, this tank went through a tremendous amount of testing. They're not only DOT, but they're CE approved, which covers most of the world. And so that's the tank itself. That's the main part of the system. What you wear on you as the accommodating part is the jetpack. The jetpack has a pump. The pump is a water pump that just takes water from the surrounding and pumps it into the tank. So this is the pump itself. And we have a quick connect, just like a BC. There's a hose that's not shown here, but there's a hose that comes out of the tank and connects to the pump. The pump is powered by a battery, and we have an on-off button. And all in all, it's a very simple mechanism. There's nothing automated in this. When you're ready to descend, you touch the button, the pump will start, and it will start flowing water into the tank. When you're done, you just stop it, or it will stop by itself. In order to release pressure from the tank, you open this purge valve. The bladder itself is pressurized, and it always have air in it. Even if it didn't, it will push water out regardless. It's built for that. And so you don't need the battery to push water out of the tank. Purge water out of the tank, all you do is you open the purge, water will come out. So this is the mechanism in which you control buoyancy today, but the methodology and the philosophy is very different. This is what the assembled system look like. This is the hose that I mentioned before that goes between the hydro tank and the pump. And that's what we're diving now. So a bit of an animation here about how the whole process works. You jump into the water, say from a boat, and you're buoyant. Because again, you have a tank that's lightweight and is buoyant. There's no weights on you, or if we need weights, sometimes we add weights, but they're 2 pounds. When you're ready, you operate the pump by pressing the button, and it runs water into the tank. Now, you can look at it as adding mass of water into the tank, or you can look at it as losing buoyancy. From a physics perspective, it doesn't matter. You make the tank smaller. And when you reach neutral buoyancy, you just swim down. The beauty of this is that nothing really changes. You can go down to 100 feet or well below, but we will talk about the recreational limits here, and you will remain buoyant. And if you stop swimming, you just remain neutral. After 20 minutes of a dive, you will consume enough gas that you will feel some difference. And the math is, if you lose about 1.5 pounds of air, that's where your tidal volume, you start to feel like you're buoyant. With every breath, you go up a little bit. It's very different than a BC today. It's very, very subtle. And so all you need to do is you pump a bit more water into the tank. And usually that will be another 1 pound of water, and that will last another 20 minutes or more of a dive. That depends on your air consumption rate. And you continue your dive. One of the things that you notice with this is that on the ascent, which is where people tend to sometimes lose their buoyancy or buoyancy control, there's no such thing. You just swim up, you swim to your depths, and when you stop, you just hover. And if you're a photographer, then where you stop, you keep your finger on the trigger. You don't need to touch a BC. There's nothing to touch. You barely touch the system throughout the dive. Once or twice, maybe 3 times. You do your safety stop, and when you're done, and you reach the surface, that's the only time in the dive that usually people will open the purge valve that I mentioned before. And the pressure in the bladder will push the water up. It's a mechanical system. And you go back to be buoyant or positively buoyant, even more so because you lost some of the gas mass that was in the tank. So by now, we told the world that we're doing this. We started doing this in 2019. We kept quiet, and then COVID helped us keeping quiet about this because we knew that as soon as we got into the water, it was a revolutionary sensation in scuba. We were all diving instructors, we all taught before, and we just couldn't believe how much better scuba can be. And in 2021, we exposed it to the world that we're working on this, and just recently we went commercial with it. By now, we have well over 2,000 dives, and what we're learning from divers from all across the board, including people at the level of Dan Hour, is that diving is just a lot more intuitive for any diver. Lung control becomes second nature in minutes. Those skills that some students struggle with become second nature because the tidal volume is what controls scuba. When you give them a tool like this, they develop lung control that would have taken them hundreds of dives to get to. Air consumption is significantly improved, especially for inexperienced divers, because again, they're staying in that zone of neutral buoyancy and they're always neutral. It's easy to regain that. Overall, the whole diving experience is boosted. Everything feels effortless underwater. The hydrodynamics is better. Again, there's no sail on you. It's better above and below the water because it's lighter. It's easier to use and it's easier to teach, and it's safer. And here I'm going to turn it to Dan.
Okay. Well, let me explain how I was introduced to this whole system. At the DEMA show, I went to a seminar that was similar to this that Aviad gave. And I'm sitting in the room with, and quite a few people. The room was full, and looking around, there were a lot of other people who were very experienced divers listening to this. And I looked at them and they were shaking their heads, I don't know if this is going to work. How does this work? And I think after the presentation was over, I think everybody was convinced that this really is a new way to dive. And when the photograph there is a photograph that was taken of me because after seeing the presentation, I had an opportunity to meet Aviad, and we went to Maui, and I did test dives on the system, and it really is a new way of diving. And you notice that I have no buoyancy compensator on, which felt unusual in the beginning because when I first got in the water, my first impulse was to reach for the power inflator, and there's no power inflator there. But once I got used to it, it didn't take very long for me to become accustomed to how comfortable it felt. It really was all those things that Aviad was saying. And when you look at buoyancy issues, and from the presentations that I've given to this group over the last number of years, my interest really is diving safety. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to make sure this really was a safe system to use, especially when things didn't work as they were designed. And when you look at the data, having been at Dan for 23 years, looking at a lot of fatality data and talking to you folks about a lot of fatality data, in 2008, they did a research project where they analyzed almost 1,000 diving fatalities. And when you look at the triggering events of those diving fatalities, about 63% of them are related to equipment in some way. And in the top 6 of those triggering events was buoyancy issues. Dan did another research project in 2015 where they analyzed fatalities again. And again, buoyancy control was one of the issues that triggered some diving fatalities. And we all know there are chronic issues with overweighting. And I can tell you that really is not an issue with this equipment. And you notice in that photograph of me, I'm wearing a wetsuit. And with that wetsuit, normally I wear about 16 to 18 pounds of lead with that wetsuit. And when I dived this system, I was down to 4 pounds, 4 pounds of lead. So I took off at least 12 pounds of lead, plus the cylinder is about 15 pounds lighter than a standard 80. So when I came up that ladder at the end of the dive, I had about almost 30 pounds less weight coming up that ladder. And for an old guy like me, I mean, that really was a significant difference and really made the whole thing really worthwhile. So let's go on to the next slide. And one of the things I wanted to do was to, again, look at the system if things did not work as they were designed. And so if you look at standard scuba, when you have a loss of weight, and that loss of weight could be from dropping a weight pouch out of your weight integrated buoyancy compensator or having a power inflator that sticks, because sometimes that happens. And there is a lot of data, of course, that talks about those equipment malfunctions. And a lot of it has to do with, of course, maintenance issues. But when that happens, then you get rapid and dramatic buoyancy changes. And all of a sudden, you're trying to deal with the mechanics of your rapid buoyancy change and trying to make sure that you're exhaling properly, you're breathing properly, so you don't have a medical issue on the way to the surface. So there are a lot of rapid, dramatic things that take place when your buoyancy changes dramatically. But when you look at the Avelo system, the issue that would create a change in buoyancy like that would be a water leak where the water continues to go into the hydro tank and compresses that breathing bag that's on the inside, or the air bag that's on the inside. And that does make you slightly negative, but it's something that takes place over a period of time. So there is nothing that is rapid and dramatic. I mean, I played with the system to make sure that I was simulating a water leak. And again, it was a very slow process to really notice any buoyancy change at all. Next. Okay, then the next one would be where you have a compromised buoyancy compensator. Now that actually could be from the BC being damaged somehow. In fact, when I was in Cuba, I did a trip to Cuba this past year, and on one of the dives, one of the divers got in, the dive master handed his equipment in the water, and the hose detached from the buoyancy compensator. And so all of a sudden he lost all that buoyancy and it sank to the bottom. He then had to struggle to get the thing back up to the surface. And so again, the buoyancy change was rapid and dramatic. And that can be a real serious problem. In fact, you might have seen a video online of a diver who panicked. And this diver who panicked was with a group of divers. And at the end of the dive, they started their ascent. They all gave each other the thumbs up signal. They all started towards the surface. And this diver immediately dumped air out of her buoyancy compensator because she was overweighted, I think, in the beginning, and therefore she had a lot of air in her BC. So, and she had been told by somebody that there was a potential problem with loss of buoyancy control to get closer to the surface. So right before she started her ascent, she dumped all the air out of her BC. So as her companions are going to the surface, she's kicking and kicking and kicking, and all of a sudden her feet hit the bottom, and she realized she was sinking, and she panicked and went flying to the surface, and luckily she survived that experience. But that can't happen with a system like this. So with a system like this, if you have a water overfill, for example, that's going to change your buoyancy, and that is something that takes place over a period of time. And so you're not going to have any rapid and dramatic changes, and all you have to do is to purge water out of the system. And it just takes a movement with your hand back towards the dial to do that. And so there's no, again, rapid and dramatic changes. And the other thing that you think about is it does away with all the mechanics involved in buoyancy control, because literally you're neutrally buoyant. In fact, on one of the dives, we were at the Molokini crater, and I was down at about 50 feet trying to simulate what it's like to be a photographer, like Aviad was talking about, where I simulated having my hands on a camera. And so I'm down there hovering literally inches above the bottom, and I heard Aviad make a noise. And I turned and looked up at him because he was right above me, and there was a whale shark up near the surface. So immediately, without taking my hands off my simulated camera, I turned and I swam up towards the whale shark and got probably about 10 feet from the surface. And during that period of time, there was no change in buoyancy at all, none. I was completely neutrally buoyant from the bottom all the way to right below that whale shark. I mean, it's a phenomenal system. Next.
But Dan, the key question is, did you get a good simulated picture of the whale shark?
I had a prize-winning simulated photo. In fact, I thought about sending that simulated photo to National Geographic. So if you open a copy of National Geographic and there's a blank page there, that's my photo.
And that would be the April 1st issue, I'm sure.
Probably so. Okay. Now, the other things can happen. For example, if you have loss of battery power. So let's think about the dive. So you get in the water and you're at the surface and the battery fails. Nothing happens. Nothing happens at all. I mean, you're slightly positively buoyant. Nothing happens. So you're slightly positive and you can simply come up to the boat and power the battery or charge the battery or change batteries, whatever you need to do. Nothing dramatic happens. Okay, then let's say you're in the water column and the battery fails. If you're in the water column and you use the system correctly, you're neutrally buoyant. If the battery fails, nothing happens. You don't even notice it. Nothing happens until you'd want to use that pump. And generally, as Aviad said, you don't need it throughout the dive. You may need it as part of the dive when you use that part of your air volume in the cylinder. So again, nothing happens. And let's say the battery fails when you are at your safety stop. You're neutrally buoyant. Nothing happens. Nothing happens at all. So all you have to do is swim to the surface and everything is fine. So again, there's no rapid and dramatic changes. And a lot of times you would not even notice things happen. Next. Now, Aviad, do you want to talk about the testing?
Well, I'll take that.
Okay.
Before I get into this, what Dan is referring to is really the system make the boundaries of buoyancy a lot closer to your tidal volume. That's the secret to this whole thing. Up until now, there was a huge difference between the BC and the bubble that's in it and all the different forces on us compared to the tidal volume. The secret here is that it just defines the boundaries a lot closer to the tidal volume by changing the tank. So if the bladder is compromised, that was the question that we got before.
Yeah.
So these bladders are built to withstand forces that are 20,000 PSI, above and beyond what the scuba industry ever reaches. And they've went through tremendous testing, including 85,000 cycles. 85,000 cycles is like 40 years of a tank. And the bladders don't get compromised. We had to compromise them for testing. So yours truly here had to put a pin in one and see what it does. And the first time that we did that, we all stood there waiting for the mushroom cloud to, consume us. And nothing happened. And so we took it on a dive. And again, nothing happened. We couldn't even feel that there's a difference. So we punctured it more, and then we started slicing it and cut diamond shapes in it. What happens with the bladder is that it emits air out. The air is the compressible stuff. So air would leak into the inner side of the tank. It will saturate the liquid very quickly. And that's it. From that point on, there's no water that goes into the tank. I actually had to cut the bladder in half and go dive with it. And only if you flip on your head, which is like standard scuba tanks. Standard scuba tank all have water in them. That's why you have a deep tube on the valve. But in this system, if you have a compromised bladder, the only way that you would know is when you open the purge, air will start coming out. So you close the purge. But it's not an emergency. And it is one of the things when you hear about the system, you're like, well, what happens if the bladder is compromised? Really nothing. And it was tested above and beyond. And let me tell you, it's very hard to compromise those bladders. There really is no friction between them and the wall. And it just, even if you did, all that will happen is that now you have a tank. It's just a smaller tank than you had before, but it's with the same amount of air because the air doesn't really change. It's very different than with a standard scuba tank. Usually the concern is an O-ring that fails. So if you have an O-ring failure, the air just leaves the tank and that's a problem. Here, it's not the case. The air is contained. It's inside that shell. Again, there's ample time to safely end the dive, including safety stop. And this was done.
Yeah. And can I make another comment?
Yep.
The other thing that I like about the system too, it uses a DIN fitting instead of a yoke that you have on some regulators. And the DIN fitting, of course, in my opinion, is much safer because you have a captured O-ring, so you're less likely to ever blow an O-ring.
A lot of questions that we're getting there is, do we need to change the entire, the entire dive show? Not at all. Hydro tanks are just like a standard scuba tank. You can fill them to 3000 PSI, and then you'll get 80 cubic feet inside the tank. But the hydro tank is a much higher pressure tank. In fact, it's even higher than 4350, but we limited it to 4350 because the standard scuba regulator is limited to 4350. But the tanks themselves can hold more. So usually today, a standard compressor that will fill that tank to 4350, you will get the equivalent of 106 cubic feet of air. And what we're seeing right now from our data is for recreational divers, the dive time is almost equivalent to 120 cubic feet of air because the buoyancy is so much better. And then I think we'll talk about it a bit about the ease that suddenly diving this system brings in between the drag and the fact that buoyancy is always perfect. You almost can't get out of perfect buoyancy. We're seeing much longer dives on recreational divers, but there's no change to infrastructure. Those are DIN valves. Again, they're common in some places. Enriched air compatible, yes, to 50%. Oxygen, we hydro test it every 5 years, just like a standard thing. They're being hydro tested just like a standard thing. Visually inspected every year, again, just like a standard tank. We recommend that the bladder will be replaced when needed or 5 years. An Avelo technician will make that call. The system was built to be rated to 200 meters. Per then, I will remind everybody that the recreational limit is not 200 meters, but we had to build it for safety reasons. And then we are in joint ventures with some of the leading industry brands. This will be announced more officially later on this year, but they understood. The heads of the industry came here to Maui, had the same experience, and there is an understanding of where this is going. So it fits within current infrastructure, and it does support future improvements, and it's the beginning. It's the beginning of going into a much lighter industry with benefits that are very hard to achieve with a BC. What we're doing right now is, as I said, we went commercial 5 weeks ago. We are swamped in Maui we're booked out. We're teaching people how to use the system. We do it in 2 ways. You can do it as a daily, that you just come in and you do 2 dives. That's the dives that Dan did, where we intentionally do all of this. We practice everything we just told you about. You come to Maui and you dive it, you will overuse the pump and you will dump the entire water of the tank to see what it feels like. And you'll go up and down the water column in ways that you will reach for your BC all the time because everybody does. And you'll see, and you're welcome to bring your 7mm suit. We just had the groups from Japan who showed up with 7 and 8mm suits, wanted to see if that's really the case. And yes, it's really the case. So the other thing that we're offering is a week-long Avelo experience. And that is a more luxury trip where, you come in and you learn how to dive it day one, but then you experience it in different environments, shore dives and boat dives. And it's very different than standard scuba. It's hard to imagine how much different this is before you dive.
Yeah, it's really an incredible system. And I'll tell you, I still can't get over being able to dive with a wetsuit on with 4 pounds of lead. I mean, I can't remember the last time, even when I was diving in the 1960s without a BC, I don't even think I wore 4 pounds of lead then. And coming up that ladder, I mean, I intentionally came up slow just so I would feel whatever the weight would be, and weighing nearly 30 pounds less. I mean, it was an eye-opening experience and a back-saving experience.
That's something that I will mention this, even for somebody like Dan, who has, 150,000 dives. Even then, there's something about this. You go into an environment where you suddenly don't need a BC. We're mentally so used to the fact that we need to feel heavy that we all overweigh ourselves, even though we believe that we are perfectly neutrally buoyant with the weight, like perfect weighting. And I told them that, and I think it was shown through the few days that we dove, that as you dive the system more, you start to lose weight. You use less and less and less weight. And we're seeing people that lost, as Dan said, 30 pounds is significant. I mean, if you go back to that slide where I'm showing that, if we're carrying 70 pounds today and you can dive on 40 pounds, it's a significant difference. And that's what we're doing here every day. The way we work is Avelo works with dive shops. We don't work directly with the end user. We don't sell units. That all the dive shops will do that. Putting together hubs, Avelo hubs, both in the US and in some other location outside of the US, where they will teach and they'll probably rent out the systems first, and then eventually they're going to sales. But the hubs will be where the system will start to disseminate into the larger market. And we're working. We have a lot of interest. We're very busy right now. And I think I'll open it up for questions.
All righty. Well, Aviad, excuse me. The first thing we do is have your share screen, if you will.
You want me to stop sharing?
Yeah. And I can't get my camera to turn back on, but it will eventually. Let's see.
Yeah, you're frozen.
Hopefully you all didn't get kicked out.
Now our show.
All right, hold on.
There you are.
Oh yeah, that's right. Because let me see here if I'm still okay. Hopefully everybody didn't get kicked out on that. I got an error message here, and all of a sudden it all went away. So Aviad and Dan, thank you. Our tradition here, Glenn is leading the way with our applause for thing, and we'll start with the Q&A. I get the first question as always. I got a bunch of notes written down, but I won't hog the discussion. Here's the first thing that I'm just wondering, and it sort of has nothing to do with buoyancy, but it has to do with physics. So if I'm understanding this correctly, so we have the bladder inside the tank, and I can introduce water into the tank, which reduces the size of the bladder.
Yeah.
Just for the sake of argument, let's say I'm measuring 3,000 PSI. It's the beginning of the dive. I put enough water in the tank that I reduce the bladder. Dan's laughing. He's anticipating my question.
Yeah.
Reduces the bladder to half the size. Does it double the pressure that I'm going to read on my gauge?
If you put that much water, before you get to that, you will be so heavy, you don't need that much water. Yes, it will introduce the pressure. But let me go back to sharing my screen, because we have a slide about that. If you wanted the real answer to this,
while he's doing that,
collaborations that we have.
That was one of the things I noticed. So when I started putting water in the hydro tank, my pressure gauge needle went up.
Jane, yeah, that's what I would think.
Here you go.
There we go.
So, of course, we all dive air integrated dive computers, and the first thing that you're seeing is that the pressure will go up, right? I mean, you have the same number of molecules, you put them in a smaller space, pressure must go up. It does. You are diving with a compressor on your back. And so it actually shows you, this is a graph from a real dive. And that's what an Avelo, classic Avelo dive would look like. I'm doing it in bar. I'm used to the metric system. It's easier to do all the calculations too.
That's okay, because everybody on this call can multiply by 15. So I know that everybody knows a bar is in round numbers 15. Well, let's put it this way. I'll do the denigrating joke. If you're a PADI diver, you think it's 15 PSI. If you're a NAUI diver, you know it's 14.7. But anyhow, please go ahead.
It's exactly what you said. Now, what you said was, this is heavily exaggerated. Usually, we actually limited the pump to stop. When you start the pump, it will stop automatically after a minute. And what you'll get is 2 pounds of water. And that's really all you need. You could run the pump over and over. Believe me, Dan, if you look at Dan's profile, you will see it seesawing all the way, because he tested the system and he wanted to make sure that he pumps it up. Yes, the tank is, these tanks are tested to 15,000 PSI. They're much, much more robust than standard scuba. But the point is, you only put how much, the amount of water that you need. And this is a classic case. You start with about 228, which is closer to 3,300. And then you put as much water as you need, and it will go to about 288. That's usually where people end up. Then you just breathe. And you can see that this diver here, from minute 3 of the dive to minute 32, didn't touch anything. Despite the fact that they went from 0 to 20 meters or 66 feet, there was no buoyancy changes. They didn't need it, they just breathed. So you can see that you can see the decline. And then you see another, so you start the pump, to your point, and you can see the dip. So now, because you have a lot less gas molecules in here, when you put water in, there's less to compress. So you also see a smaller bump here and a smaller bump here. In fact, if I wouldn't show you that, when you see how we do our air monitoring, you can dive this system with an analog gauge. And what you note is the first time that you stop the pump, you note your pressure. That's your reference pressure. So instead of your 228, your reference pressure for air monitoring is this 288 or whatever. Let's say that you are at 3,800 PSI. That is your reference. If you use the rule of thirds, then you turn back after a third of that pressure and you come back after 2/3. But that allows us, I'm going to hijack your question here. That allows us to do some interesting things. So here is a real, again, this is the same profile. When you take an air integrated dive computer, any air integrated dive computer, and you look at the data, by now we have logs of more than 2,000 of those. What you notice is you can translate that pressure increase to know exactly how much water is in the tank. And the water that's in the tank, as you can see, this is the volume of the bladder. Okay. And so the bladder here is something that this is when I say you actually make the tank smaller. This pressure increase can be translated to know exactly how much water is in the tank, which means I know how much you breathe, and I know how much water you put in the tank. So I know the buoyancy of a diver through the entire dive at a resolution of 0.1 pounds of force. That allows us to develop a tool that is called the buoyancy diagram. There's a lot more depth to this technology that we're showing usually. If this is your zero, if this is the net force on you throughout the dive, and Ken, you decided that you're putting that much water in the tank, right? It will bring you down to the bottom of the zone. So the boundaries here are your tidal volume. And each of us are different, right? Let's say that my tidal volume is 600 milliliters. So I can control the force on me really easily between those boundaries. Anywhere inside these boundaries, you will feel perfectly neutral. You won't even know. And so the entire dive, I track where you are inside the zone. And this diver didn't have any means on them to know. They just felt that they're getting, outside, and they started a pump, and they pumped one cycle, and it put that much water in. They're still inside the zone. The recommendation is actually to do 2 cycles. So you'll go all the way down, and then you surf on that for the rest of the dive. This tool allows you to actually see where a diver is and how close they are to perfect neutral buoyancy throughout the dive. So your question actually leads to a tool that was developed specifically for that. And the next step is we're actually working with one of the leading brands on the dive computer that will show you that this is real data from real dives. That's what an Avelo dive looks like. It didn't capture the beginning of the dive here when the first fill was done. But the rest of the dive, you can see that this diver is surfing, no touching the pump. This is a pump. They purged a little bit. You capture every little thing throughout the dive. And you can actually fix behaviors on students or people where you can see that they're outside of the zone. You can show them. You show them where their tidal volume is, and you can show them where they should start the dive. And you can fix buoyancy issues very, very quickly. If this was a BC, by the way, this is on a diver, we're within 0.6 kilograms of force. If this was a BC with 14, 16, 18 pounds, or a BC with a lift of 30, this chart dwarfs, because again, we're all used to those very large forces on us, up and down throughout the dive. So that was a very long way to answer your question.
Yeah, and I guess the short version of my question was really, my concern is because that same fatality study that Dan mentioned also indicated that I think the number was 47% of the fatalities start by people running out of air. So part of my concern is if you have water in the tank and you're at 300 PSI, because even though you mentioned the rule of thirds, that ain't the way people dive in the real world. Divers, recreational divers, try to get as much as they can out of it. If you've got it down to, let's say, 300 or 500 PSI, is that going to be a true reading, or do you realize as you're starting to surface, I really don't have that much, that the added pressure came because we were shrinking the size of that bladder?
So there will be a change in pressure. It will be barely significant. That's something that I showed Dan when he was here. We're teaching that. We have a course for instructors, that's the Avelo Pro, and we're going into detail with this. But at the end of the day, during a dive, when you're at 300 PSI and you put water in the tank, you'll barely see a change in the needle. And again, the amount of air doesn't change. In fact, what we found, that's what we get from instructors now in the field, is that people actually watch their gauge a lot more, because it's interesting to see the pressure going up through the dive. And so they're actually, 90% of the problem is that people are just not looking at the gauge. Let's start there, and so, but it's just interesting. Again, the changes here are minimal. But this is something that you have to dive in order to see. Yeah, then go ahead.
Yeah. Also, there's an online training program you go through to become a recreational Avelo diver. And so that kind of gives you a lot of those details and lets you know what happens when you're using the system. But I'll tell you, one of the dives we did, the bottom was really irregular. So the bottom got as deep as 40, 45 feet, went up to almost the surface. And we were going up and down and up and down and up and down with no change in buoyancy whatsoever. I mean, it's about as effortless as you can possibly get.
Cool. All right. Well, let's see if anyone else. Aviad, can you stop the share screen, and that way I can end up seeing everybody? Yeah. And Robin's got a question. Unmute yourself, Robin. Nope. Almost.
Yeah.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
There you go. You're up.
Yes. Hi. Yes. So in that last picture where it said thank you and it showed the woman backside diving, right?
We can't see her hands here.
Oh, I'm 5 feet tall on a good day, and the setup looked really tall. Right. And if it's too long, I'm kicking it in the back or it's hitting the back of my head. So what's the height versus like an average 80 or even a stubby 100?
Have a shorter thing. There's a shorter version. There's a shorter version of this thing. And the girl that is in that, the girl in the picture is also 5 feet tall. Yes, we actually found out that that's Harmony. She is our beloved instructor, and she's part of the team. She is short, and we actually found out that we forgot to mention that. But then tell them about how we dive this system.
Well,
the valve.
Yeah, there is. For one thing, the one thing I had a hard time getting used to is the valve. The cylinder is actually in the backpack backwards, so the valve opens not towards the back of your head, but away from the back of your head, which I had a hard time getting used to, because when I gave lectures on mistakes that people made with equipment, that's one of the mistakes people make, where they put the cylinder in the backpack backwards, have to put the regulator upside down and backwards. But the way this system works, it works that way, and that way your head is not banging on the regulator. And so it really is relatively easy to use. Plus, also, again, it's so much lighter, but there is a smaller version.
Yes, we have. The real answer is we have a shorter version for shorter people. I'm 5'6". I hear you.
What's the volume differential between the shorter version and the regular version?
Are we talking inner volume of the
total air pressure?
No, bottom time.
Usable volume.
Capacity. We're talking capacity. Yes, the capacity. The standard tank is a 10-liter inner volume, and so it will give you, as I said, if you fill it to full, it's 106, and the shorter version is equivalent, if you fill it to full, to an 80.
Is equivalent to what?
It's equivalent to
an
an
80, an 80 cubic feet.
an 80,
So
but that's
if you
at,
fill it- again,
it's equivalent to
fill it
80
all the
at
way.
4,350 PSI.
right.
Yeah.
If you fill it to the usual, give me the pressure and I'll tell you what the
Well,
the
if you,
cubic-
I just top of my head, if you did the 3,000 PSI, then the 80 probably becomes a,
it will become
about a 60,
65.
a 65.
65 cubic feet.
So Robin, it's sort of the same. I don't know if you ever dive with a short tank. I dive with a 63.
Yeah,
Normal.
so 63. So
Yeah,
it just,
so
it
it's
just,
sort of the equivalent of a short tank.
yeah, two more cubic feet over 60.
Yeah, but if you
Yeah.
fill it to 4,350, then it's equivalent to an 80.
Well,
Right.
if you fill it to 8690, it's equivalent to a 160. Terrific. Regulator can't handle it, but we got plenty of air.
I usually dive with a stubby 100.
Mm.
One of the HP 100s. Yeah.
Yeah, then you can dive.
And Robin, I keep muting you to get rid of the
Echo.
when Aviad was talking there. So if you need to add something, just unmute yourself again. It's not, I'm not lashing out against you. It's just,
Another
just
question.
that way. Yeah.
Another-
Glenn, you've got your hand up.
Unmute myself.
There we go. You got it.
I have
Glenn.
a ton of questions. So scalability, I see it perhaps a couple problems. You plan on scaling it up by dive shops, so I take it would not be possible to use this system if you're traveling like to a foreign destination. Partly.
It depends. People, people fly now with breathers. And so you could, it's a lighter shell. I mean, it's a much lighter shell. I fly with it if I need to get places. That's not the business plan is really to populate dive shops in specific destinations, especially destinations diving. We happen to be in Hawaii, so Hawaii is one. But around the world, we're seeing a lot of interest. But the idea is if you fly with anything, you fly with a jetpack, not the tank. The tank should wait for you at the destination. And so we're building destination. I can tell you that a lot of them are here. I'm in between visits right now of destination and the major destinations. They understand. They understand what it does to them in terms of safety and attraction, what it can do to the scuba industry. But it will take time. You're right. If you wanted to fly with a system, then you need two tanks and a jetpack. One battery is enough, although you can get two. Can you fly with it? Yes. It would fit in a suitcase. As somebody that does it all the time, I'd prefer that the tank will wait for me.
Aviad, what's the dry weight of everything? If you're actually flying with it, what's the dry weight of everything? No air in it, obviously.
36 pounds.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. Like, it's a thing. Like, it's a thing to go fly with it. If you wanted to take the tanks with you,
Right.
that you definitely could. Not unlike standard scuba, there's a large opening at the top. You can actually open it up and you separate. Anyway, you have to leave tanks open so PSA can inspect them. So you can. That's not how I would do it.
At some point in time, it'll be available on liveaboards also, so you can go to the liveaboard and have it there.
That's where I was going on that.
Yes.
So dive shops generally don't fill up to 4,000 pounds. Is that a problem? Do you see that as a problem going forward?
No, the system was designed for them to actually keep what they're doing today. The tank can accommodate more. So we're seeing more and more dive shop that has a Haskell booster, and they just, it's in line to the compressor, and then they boost up to what they need. Honestly, how many of us actually need 120 cubic feet? And 80 is
I was gonna say, I know a couple of people. We lovingly,
No, but that's
Aviad,
what
we
I'm saying.
lovingly call them ASPs, air sucking pigs.
But for that, they do find the dive shops that will boost, right? So it's equivalent. In that regard, it is equivalent. It is a high pressure thing. In general, by the way, carbon fiber, this is called the COPB, carbon over a pressure vessel, and it's a type 3. There used to be in the scuba industry a type 2, which was nothing but an aluminum tank with just carbon fiber around it. This is actually a type 3, so it can go to a much higher pressure, but it's designed to work with the current infrastructure. You'll get what you'll get today in terms of the amount of air.
You know, it's funny. I used to actually be certified for carbon fiber inspections as a bus mechanic, essentially.
Then you know.
Yeah, and I've always been fascinated about carbon fiber technology, specifically in scuba diving, and buoyancy was the issue. So salt water's not really a problem because it's a closed system. It's a very high pressure water pump, I take it, right?
Yes, it's a small displacement. So those pumps are they're coming from the fracking industry. The pumps that can do that can get to like 60,000 psi. It's a low flow though. The trick here is that if you go to a low flow, you can reach very high pressure.
Yes. Where do I sign up? When do I sign up?
Come to Maui. Right now it's in Maui. Again, we're scaling up. We have tons of equipment that's being manufactured right now. And as I said, we're opening hubs. The hubs will be where to go. So in you guys' area, there will be a hub. Right now we're screening through candidates. And as I said, we're getting requests from all over. Australia, Japan, the Red Sea, obviously Florida and California.
Glenn,
we're in the process of setting those up.
We'll drop you off in Maui on the way back from the Maldives in November.
I want to do it before then.
Okay. Fair enough.
Come to Maui. If you come to Maui, as I said, there's 2 ways to do that. Either you sign up and you do it for the day, or you do a day of a few dives. Or if you want the whole thing, then the package is definitely the way to go.
Okay.
The trip really is very different because not only you learn it, we intentionally go into different environments. It was designed mainly for professionals, not only, but for professionals to really experience it in everything they thought, it's very unintuitive. And so it's people would come in and they tackle us. You know how many 6-packs I have by now of people trying to challenge us with my wetsuit does compress. We know.
So
What about trim while you're diving? Is that an issue? And what, like you're carrying 4 pounds, I guess, on a weight belt because this is
no, it actually fit in. It actually fit into the bottom of the cylinder. There's a plastic piece that's there that protects the valve that's down there, and so we had that weight there. So I didn't have a weight belt on at all, and I was perfectly trim. I mean, I don't think I've been trim like that for a long, long time. And again, it was amazing because I was trying to hover literally inches above the bottom to be able to control my buoyancy simply by my breathing. And again, with my hands out as though I had a camera. It was fabulous.
For example, we put several places where you can add weight because people dive with dry suits and there's technical diving and people want to drive this side mount. And, as soon as you expose it, everybody will bring their own flavor to this. So yes, there are several places to put weights on the system and add the weight that you need. And we teach that in the e-learning program. It teaches exactly how to weigh yourself with the Avelo system for those scenarios and where to put the weight to get the trim. It is surprising. I have to tell you, I dove a dry suit. We had photographers showed up and did a whole series of they're diving dry suits, and they're reducing their weight significantly. I mean, they'll dive with a dry suit with 6 pounds. And it does change it. Obviously, you need to control the dry suit.
And with that, when I talked about wearing 4, I think had I been there longer, I would have been able to get down to almost 0 lead. I mean, that to me was absolutely amazing. But
Cool.
I do see a couple more hands up.
Yeah, Jeff Walsh, you patiently had your hand up there for a while, and then Rob will come back to you after that. Jeff, you're up.
So getting actually 2 questions. And the first one is, Dan just said he could get down to 2 or 0 pounds. So if you're already diving with like 0 lead in Southern California, does it just add? I mean, there's a limit on how buoyant you can make it. So if you're in a tropical destination and low body fat, and you're normally not buoyant at all, how does it work?
Well, the system itself is lightweight. It's not the amount of weight really is not where the focus is. The tank itself is 15 pounds lighter. So you're starting from such a lightweight system that is much more buoyant than it is light. The game here is changing. The system itself is buoyant. So yes, there's a limit,
Okay.
but the system is buoyant. And so it's the tank itself that provides that initial buoyancy. What you add
Okay.
is with your wetsuit, but as you said, in tropical waters, you're going into smaller wetsuit, so it balances itself out.
Okay, and then my other question, which is getting back to the beginning about running out of air. If the volume of the tank is constantly changing with your depth, and as you're using air, how do you know how much breathing gas you've got left? If because it's all dependent on the size of your tank.
Right. The volume of the tank does not change. You change it once at the beginning of the dive, and then it stays constant. You just breathe air out of it, but the volume of it does not change. The volume of it, if you want to look at it as a solid, if you have, let's say, 3,000 psi in the tank, right? You put water in, the water will push the tank to a certain size, then it's frozen in that size. The air always wants to push the boundaries of the bladder out. It's best to look at it as a solid. I think the best analogy to think about this is, imagine starting a dive with an 80, regular aluminum 80, and 30 minutes afterwards, you just make your tank 63, the size of a 63. And then you make it towards the end of the dive, make it into a size of a 50. Then you end the dive. We teach it. For that, you need to go through the e-learning, and you see at the end of the day, and Dan can talk about it from his experience. You will not see a difference between how you dive now and how you dive the system. If you do have an analog gauge, you will not see the difference in the needle. They're just not that accurate. So you will use it, you will monitor your air just like you do today. And I did that with them.
If you're going from an 80 to a 60 partway during your dive,
Right.
your SPG is going to show an increased pressure when you change it, because you're compressing the gas.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I was showing. I don't know if you saw that slide. That happens at the beginning of the dive. And so you note that initial pressure. We call it the maximum pressure. And that's your reference pressure for the rest of the dive. And that's what you always refer to. That if on the surface before you started the dive, say you had 3,000 psi, and you went from, as you said, 80 to 63, you do that at the beginning of the dive. That's when you need the water in the tank to begin with. And then it goes to 3,700 psi. That is your reference pressure. The rest of the dive is always compared to that 3,700. In essence, you just started the dive with a 63 that was just compressed to a lot more, air. But that's it. From then on, you have 30 minutes that it stays the same. The next time that you start the pump, as I said, if you have an air integrated dive, then you will be able to see the difference in pressure as it goes up a bit. And as I said, we're making use of it. If you don't and you're on an analog gauge, you won't even see the difference.
But Aviad, maybe the way to look at this, are you saying that at the beginning of the dive, you add some water and it adjusts the volume of the bladder? You then don't touch that again at all until the end of the dive and you're done? Because if that's the case, then for Jeff as well, regardless of what the pressure changes initially, whether it's 3,000, 35, 3,700, that'll all still be relative to that pressure. Because I think Jeff and I are under the same impression. If that bladder size is changing throughout the dive, it's going to affect the reading of the pressure.
Oh,
Yeah, but
absolutely.
it's not changing a lot. As Aviad mentioned, the major changes at the beginning. The rest of it is really just incremental, because you really don't put much water into the system during the dive, just to maybe change the buoyancy by a pound or two, but you're not talking about a dramatic change.
I'll tell you how I came to this. So obviously, I come from an engineering background, and that was my concern when I did a calculation originally, and I thought that that's going to be a big issue. And we thought that you would have to use a specific computer to do this, and we did a calculation of how much changes for each milliliter of water that was in there and all that. And then we started diving. and very quickly you see that you just don't need it. And so we started going back to the computers to log the dive. So all of us are diving with an analog in one hand and in a computer on the other because we record the data. And you can see that towards starting at the beginning of the dive, there's all kinds of things that I can get into, like density shifts and temperature changes in the tank and all that. But at the end of the day, middle of the dive, almost any within what you need in terms of water, you won't even see the changes. What we do when we teach it, though, we intentionally on the second dive, I'll tell you how the teaching works. It's a 2 dives. You come in the morning. We give you a sample of how you put the gear together, and then it's a very brief thing, and you go in and you dive just to experience it, just so you get it out of the system. The BC and the air monitoring and all that, you just go through it. You just go through a complete dive. And the only drill that we're doing is, as Dan said, we take people from 60 almost all the way to the surface, according to a computer, and it's a direct ascent, but it's slow. But it just shows that there's no buoyancy changes. And then we go back down, then we can continue the dive. On the second dive, we stress the system. And that's what we have people overfill the tank, and we have them look at the air pressure, especially for that. You can get comfortable with how much of a pressure change you get and how you monitor your air and how the air monitoring works compared to standard scuba. And then towards the end of the dive, which is the worst case scenario, we actually have them dump. That's to Jeff's question, that's the opposite side of it. What happens when you dump the water? And now you suddenly go down to, the pressure goes down. Right? This is the opposite question. To all of your question about air monitoring, we do that. That's why we do the training like that. So you can see exactly what happened to your pressure and the fact that you don't need to sit there with a calculator underwater and figure out what the pressure is doing. It's a totally understandable question. That's how I feel. When you actually are in the water and you're doing it, you see that a lot of things balance themselves.
Okay, you have another question, I think.
Yep.
Well,
Rob,
so one.
oh, go ahead, Jeff.
I mean, the whole thing still seems counterintuitive. So my last question is, do we just contact you, go to Maui and try it out? What's the deal with that?
Go on our website on Avelo. I mean, you can contact me too. I would just refer you to the Avelo Dive Center here. And soon there will be 2. But yeah,
Okay.
it's Dive with Harmony. Actually, the girl in the picture is actually the instructor. There are several instructors that work for her now. But yes, that's a Dive with Harmony on Maui would be the first place to test it. But Jeff, you're right. It's very non-intuitive. It only becomes intuitive when you actually dive it. I mean, ask them.
Yeah.
You should.
Well, yeah. I mean, it sort of sounds like it's counter to a lot of things that we've been doing
Yeah.
for many,
it is.
many years. So you got to unlearn stuff. Robin, we'll go back to you. Alan, I saw you had your hand up. We'll come to you after Robin. Robin, you're back up.
Hi,
This is my husband.
I'm the other Robin.
Well,
Robin
that's
and
okay.
Robin.
That's why I can't go wrong when I call on Robin. They're both named Robin.
So I have 2 questions. The first question is, okay, you said it will take a couple of years, but when it becomes commercially available, about how much will the system cost?
Well, it will probably compete with the standard systems. When it gets to that scale, we can't afford to make so many units. But if you see the demand for this from people that were here, to go scale up to hundreds of thousands of units that's a powerhouse. I need to, that's a Silicon Valley play.
Yeah, I got a bank to tell you to stay away from.
Yeah, no. But all I'm saying is that we need to grow this responsibly. It's counterintuitive. It has fantastic advantages over standard scuba, but you can't, and we don't want to introduce it. We are not a 4,000 employee company that needs to support overhead and all that. We can grow it responsibly and have a hub that is responsible for their region and let people experience it. Because again, because it's so unintuitive, you have to experience to understand the advantages that come with, and it will grow organically. It will grow. It's not an issue of just raising money and go, flood the market with this is not the plan.
Robin, I muted you again, so unmute yourself for your second question. There you go.
So the second question is, how far in advance are you booking for the training?
Honestly, I don't know. We're an organization that we provided you in the training.
Aviad, you just got very muddy.
It,
There we go. Try again.
I'm saying if you check our website and you check Dive with Harmony, they'll book you. They'll control their own schedule. You know, they are the provider.
So Harmony is not your partner or employee. This is someone at Maui who is doing the training
Yes,
in conjunction with you, obviously, but not.
He's also part of us, but she has her own dive shop.
Okay.
There's other dive shops here that are coming online that will be available. And we work with almost all the dive shops here in terms of services. Like we go on their boats. If you sign up for the Avelo experience, for example, then it's boats that work with us and comfortable. Many of the instructors on Maui do this. Some of them are about the level that it requires to get to the Avelo Pro, which is the instructor class. Maui in general is familiar with the technology.
All right, Alan, you're up.
All right, thank you. What a great technology. What a great demonstration of the use of engineering to apply to new uses of old things. So congratulations, that really looks terrific. And one idea that occurs to me, you may be able to make the idea of pressure gauges to judge the amount of air that's left obsolete. You can actually, with the data that you have, you can actually say, what's the weight, what's the mass of air, what's the weight of air that you have remaining, and know that exactly as you're diving.
I didn't want to get into this, but you're right. It's a mistake. If you really go back to the inception of scuba, most people don't know what pressure is and they don't understand it. This group is much more sophisticated than people that we usually talk to. They don't know what PSI is. They don't understand that there's a dependency on temperature. Just think about the fact that you have a hot tank, hot fill, and you go into the water and you lose 300 PSI. Nobody blinks an eye. Oh, that's fine.
Hey, who stole my air?
Yeah, or the fact that the pressure gauges are not accurate. The needle is really not calibrated. When was the last time that your SPG was calibrated? And so but again, I didn't know that. But I'm a chemical engineer by background, so thermodynamics is second nature. And you're right, the way that air should have been monitored regardless should have been done by weight, because then you know that if you have 6 pounds of air in there and you're now at 4, then you turn back, and if you're at 2, you're at reserve. And that won't change, regardless of temperature changes and pressure and the needle in the gauge. You're hitting on something that we're working on right now. In fact, it's even better than that. If you know pounds, to most divers, even the pounds won't make sense. The idea is to report it in percentages. You started with 100% of air. When you're at 66%, it changes color, and you know that you are now should be on your reserve. Again, if you want to use the rule of halves, or then it can be tuned to that. But the idea is report it to them in percentage. You started on a full charge, it shows you the pressure, but it also shows you the percentage. So if you started at 100%, go to 66, turn around. At 33, you're at reserve, and it should blink at you. And to Ken's point from before, now you have something that is real, just like a fuel gauge in a car, that you don't know how many gallons of gasoline you actually have, but you see the lines and you know that you're about to run out.
Yeah, but look how many people run
Just
out
keep
of
going.
gas.
It's not a problem. There's probably a gas station somewhere down the road.
And they took the analogy, right?
I'm looking for raised hands. I don't see any. So if
There's
there
one.
are, Glenn's got another one. I take it back. Unmute, Glenn. There
Okay.
you go.
So you just mentioned associations with computer manufacturers, I guess. And what about the like NAUI and PADI associations in terms of the learning aspect of this?
The answer is yes. Yeah, we developed our own. This is because it's such an unintuitive discipline, and we're seeing the verticals that come out of it. To be honest, we're at the center of it. We think that everybody that developed the curriculums did fantastically well on their own, and so can we. It's not that we're not going to go into collaborations, but we don't need that collaborations right away. And in fact, part of the reason we're working with Dan is because he was at the center of any agency and the combination of them. And so the standards that we're writing in our certification programs are all reviewed by Dan, and that's what we're working on. We can definitely, you know, we are all instructors. One thing that's unique about this team is that we're not a manufacturer that has engineers, but they don't necessarily dive. All of us came from the instructors. We're all Harmony, by the way, is a geophysicist. And everybody that's on the team, Jennifer, who's doing our marketing, she is a tech diver and an instructor. The vast majority of the team are instructors that were active for a long period of time and also had a role in something else. So to understand certification and the ecosystem of certification is not foreign to us. I personally am certified as an instructor for BISAC and CMAS and PADI, and now in the past and SSI. And then you have Dan.
Well, do you imagine, you have to show your sort of credentials to use the system in the future? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the certification program gives you that. The certification is now complete. When you're done with a day of training, you get a certification program that is legit, and that way any Avelo dive center will accept it. And you can dive, you can rent the system from that point on. You can, in the future, buy gear or components of gear, as I mentioned. And so, no, we're setting it up as it's a bit of an Apple approach where we're both, certification and whatever, not as exclusive. We're not. Sorry, please, erase that comment from the recording. Apple is great. We're just both under the same house, and I have to tell you that there's a lot of advantages in doing that. For example, when we make a change, it's not like a BC manufacturer need to then go talk to the certification agency and ask them to teach it. We're integrated. We made a change to a policy. It immediately goes into the gear, and we can enforce it by changing the gear. This whole discussion about air monitoring is something that would have taken ages if you had to do it between. Just imagine any one of the OEMs versus the scuba industry, leading agency. Then we'll tell you how long it will take them to agree on which.
Yeah, exactly. If you never get to them to agree. That's right.
We're very efficient about never agreeing on anything, almost like Congress. Aviad, let me get the last question, which sort of goes back to, well, I'll give you two questions. The second one will be easier. But you mentioned bladder replacement every 5 years. What would that cost?
Don't quote me on this again. Please erase this from the recording because marketing.
We won't hold it to
the
it.
PR people are going to say, "What? Why did you say that?" The bladders are inexpensive. They're usually between 20.
I'm sorry, how much?
I never said that. I never mentioned this. I'm not talking about prices, but they're not. The bladders are not expensive. If you knew what it cost to produce a BC.
Okay. And the other question is, looking at your logo, can you explain why the logo is designed as it is? I'm sure it means something.
Good question. That's an excellent question.
Thank you.
It is an excellent
It's like
question.
I've done this before.
There's two answers there. One is the shape that you're looking at. Just put it upside down, and it was supposed to be the A of the Avelo, but it looked like a frowny face. And so my son, who was 9 years old at the time, just flipped the page. We just flipped the shape, and it looked like a water monster. And his comment was, "Anyway, you're doing everything backwards from what the scuba industry is doing. Might as well have the logo, the A upside down." And then the other thing is that's compelling about that shape is that when you dive, you look at the shape from all directions. You can see an A and a V and an E. You'll see any one of the letters in that shape. So it worked.
Very good.
Good.
Well, I think you've given everybody an awful lot to think about and digest and everything else. And actually, when we start this, I said to him, "How long do you think we need?" He said, "Oh, we'll go for about 20 minutes or so." I said, "Well, when we don't really go past 9 o'clock." And here we are right at 9 o'clock. So that's good. That means you guys gave a good presentation and everybody was asking questions and thinking about it. And is there if they have further questions, Aviad, is there a website or an email where they can shoot you a note or shoot me a note and I'll forward it to you, or what?
Yeah, if you wanted a course, like if you wanted to get deep into this, literally sign up for the training. It will answer all of your questions because it goes deep. It goes deep. Part of it is the physics. If you don't care, you can skip over that. I mean, you still need to do that, but you can skip over the deep thing, and it will just teach you how to use the system. If you wanted to get to me, the Insider program is the best way to do that. Just on a website, if you click Insiders and you send a question, usually it will be referred to one of us and then they'll refer it to me.
But I guess what I'm saying is, since you haven't said what the website is, this would be
Avelo.
where you might
Dive
want
Avelo.
to say that.
Dive Avelo. It's www.diveavelo. You can see the picture.
Okay, so
Here.
dive and the word Avelo
Yes.
up there. And this is why Jennifer is the marketing and Aviad is the brains behind it.
Oh, she would have literally punched me for instance.
And Jennifer, we happen to know Jennifer's was it Sri Lanka? I think was where she said she's in Sri Lanka
right.
tonight. So that's why she can't join us. Well, good. If anybody has any questions, then that's the way to go. www.diveavelo.com and get
And you
it
can also
on
contact me.
inside.
You can also
Cool.
contact me.
Cool. And if you can't
You're
find
all
that,
welcome
shoot
to
me a
come
note and
tomorrow. Like,
I'll forward it on. Not a problem at all. Gentlemen, thank you very much. If we could again give the
Pleasure.
Reef
Thank you.
Seekers
See you all again.
applause there. I'll let you know next month because I will be in Bon Air on the second Tuesday. We will do the third Tuesday, which I think is the 18th. And it'll be John Cadis from the corner. Whoops, hang on. Robin, nothing personal, but you're my echo. I'm muting you again. John Cadis from the coroner's office. And we're not going to talk about, we do the Why Divers Die seminar at the Scuba Show every year. And we'll do it again this year on June 3rd. But what I've asked John to talk about is not specific fatalities, but just in general terms, when we have a scuba fatality and it comes into the coroner's office, what do they do so they don't end up just saying, oh, it's a drowning, which I'd say 90% of the medical examiners and coroners around the world, around the country do, because they sort of don't know what to look for. So we do some very unique things here at the LA County Medical Examiner's Office, and John will talk about that. So I think it's going to be pretty cool. And I can see from his nods, Mr. Orr is probably going to be back. So 18th, Dan, not
Actually,
early.
in the DAN database, 70% of the fatalities are labeled as drownings.
Yeah. And a lot of times it certainly goes deeper than that. And a lot of times it's because, and it is not meant as a slight against some of the medical examiners. A lot of times the medical examiner may be the local mortician, or it could be the sheriff. It's not necessarily a medical person. But it's also, well, they were in the water, they're dead, there's no foul play, they drowned. Next. And they want to close stuff out. So anyhow, John will speak to that, and we hope you will join us for that. So again, Aviad and Dan, thank you very much for spending time with us.
Thank
For
you.
those of you here, again, thank you for spending time with us here at Zoom Seekers. Enjoy the rain as it tapers out here in Southern California, and we will look forward to seeing you in April for another fascinating adventure of Zoom Seekers here at reefseekers.com.